All right, so I'm going to get our conversation started here. I'll ask the panelists to let me know that the audio and video is coming through okay, and then we'll get started.
Loud and clear.
Thanks so much. All right, so we're going to spend about 45 minutes together today chatting. We set this up as a panel discussion because we wanted this to be a dynamic discussion. Bresslergroup is going to offer some thoughts about the challenges we're seeing related to COVID and user research in 2020, but we're saving the last 15 minutes or so of the conversation really to have a discussion with you. So our panelists will be here to share with you, but we're really hoping to get your perspectives as well. So thanks for taking the time to chat with us. I'm Conall Dempsey. I'll introduce myself a little bit more later, but first let's get started setting the stage. So we're going to be talking about COVID's impact on user research. As many of you are probably researchers, much of this probably looks familiar to you. Traveling to far off places to go to where our users are, having the opportunity to do contextual inquiry in hospitals, heck, even in patients and customer homes, or even just the basic fundamental of being able to do user research without a face mask on, without PPE, and standing only a few feet apart from your participant, being able to read their body language. Unfortunately, COVID has had a lot of impacts on this space, and constraints have introduced a lot of challenges to how we do user research. Some of those constraints are going to have long-lasting impacts. Some are going to be shorter, but in the immediate sense, we all still are feeling the challenge to deliver user insights to our development teams, despite the fact that COVID has introduced all these new challenges. So that's what this discussion's about today, sharing how we're tackling those challenges, learning how you're tackling those challenges, and getting together as a community of researchers to sort of lift up and elevate our game, overcome this challenge together, and continue to support development. We're seeing that change already at Bresslergroup. We're going to tell you about some of those changes and how we're implementing them and how you may be implementing them yourself. We'd love to hear about that. One thing hasn't changed, despite everything that COVID's brought, is that we're still being asked by our clients and our development partners to provide user insights throughout the development process, from upfront generative research all the way through validation. And so we're here to remind you that the research questions and the needs that research brings to the table the answers to haven't changed. What's changed is our methods and the tools. And so what we're going to talk about is how do you go back to those questions, and then how do you adjust with new tools to still answer those fundamental questions? We, of course, being researchers, position that under a broad, how might we? How might we continue to gather user insights that we need for top-tier product innovation within those constraints? And in many cases, because of the way research works, we're actually on the front lines of that, where we have to have interactions with patients, with people in at-risk populations, with HCPs. And some of the other teams that also are critical to innovation and product development don't have to tackle them so head on. And working from home is sort of the end of the story. With research, it's really very much the beginning. So we've put together a team of domain experts. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Jes Koepfler, Sarah Fairchild, and Jemma Frost, and each of them will tell you a little bit more about themselves. And then they've also elected to tell about one of the tools or domains of research that they know a lot about, and will be sharing some of the strategies they're bringing to the table to help us keep moving forward. For today, I'll be covering the validation portion of user research and how we're tackling that. All of the people who are on the panel are employees of Bresslergroup, and we are an innovation firm based in the middle of Philadelphia. We support innovation in our clients, as I've mentioned, from end to end, from design strategy and generating new great ideas, all the way through production equivalent products that are just waiting for validation before they can go to market. What that means is we have to have solutions that help us answer all of the research questions all along the development pipeline. So despite those challenges of COVID, and in order to facilitate this discussion, that's the way we've broken down the conversation. How do we answer the different types of research questions that we're getting from that generative end all the way to the evaluative end of user research? Our goal for today's session is that everyone gets something out of this in terms of how they're going to go ahead and execute their own research, whether it's in partnership with us or on your own, and we want to learn from you. So what we're asking you to do is take advantage of the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll be collecting questions throughout the session, and then at the end, we're going to moderate a panel where we'll take those questions and we'll direct them to the domain experts that we bring, and of course, we invite you to contribute in answering each other's questions as well. With that, I'll pass it over to my colleague Jes to get us going.
Great, thanks, Conall. So let's talk about how we're starting to expand the playbook of user research within the context of COVID-19. So as I'm sure many of you have experienced, a lot of our go-to methods have been impacted. For example, collecting insights through in-person home visits, contextual inquiry where products are bought and sold and used, feedback on products based on physical interactions in particular, and validating products in simulated use environments. We also anticipate impacts going forward. So these are some of the things that we have seen already, and we look forward to hearing more from you on some other areas of impact. Even just at a minimum, in terms of access, we're seeing challenges related to government imposed restrictions that we've never really experienced before in user research. Limited access to the environments of use, struggles with enabling some of the physical interactions, especially very finite or micro physical interactions with products. As we move to more remote approaches, we're experiencing sort of challenges with maintaining IP and maintaining everybody's comfort level with IP, and that is intellectual property. And then as we think about PPE, even in remote context, sometimes we still have folks in locations where they won't be able to share their facial expressions with us because their faces are being covered. On the project management side, we're seeing an increased use of disposable equipment when we are able to be in person. We're seeing the potential increased rate of cancellation and no-shows because either somebody got sick, somebody's encountered somebody who got sick, or somebody who needs to care for somebody who's gotten sick. We've seen extended and potentially less predictable timelines. Again, not things that are showstoppers, but things that are new and things that we haven't really had to deal with as much in the last, say, decade of doing user research. As a result of all of these things, we've seen the need for increased backups, so building in moderators and note takers beyond the typical two-person team so that we make sure we can adjust to any issues that might arise. And then as we've moved towards different types of methods, there's additional techniques like logistics management to consider. And then perhaps most top of mind for folks is safety, whether in person or remote. We're thinking about safety when it comes to wearing PPE and how that impacts how you experience and do user research. The need for new screening questions and criteria, both during the screening process and even at the door before people walk in. Definitely building in additional time to clean and sanitize the space, the stimuli, and the equipment. And then just simply working with higher risk populations. So there are many populations out there that were high risk before. They are now at a higher risk in a pandemic situation. And we want to be very thoughtful and mindful and ethical in how we engage with those users, both in terms of bringing them into research environments, but then also in terms of inadvertently leaving them out of user research, because these are all products that they might engage with someday. So a lot of different types of impacts that we're seeing, and we're curious, what other challenges have you identified where COVID-19 has impacted your research? As Conall mentioned, please type your questions into that Q&A box below, and we'll continue that conversation at the end of our session today. So we've broken out sort of the four big buckets of research into these four topics: discover, frame, evaluate, and validate. We quickly realized that it's tedious work trying to deal with the never-ending pros and cons list that I just shared with you. And so by refocusing our energy into the four big areas of research we're trying to accomplish, it allows us to sort of take a step back and really think about not how do we replicate in-person methods remotely, but moving forward, how do we answer the research questions we need to answer with our full toolbox? And so in some cases, we might be digging up tools that we haven't used in a long time, but that are just as effective for gathering the insights we need along the way. So Jemma's going to talk to us about the discover phase and talk about how might we uncover user needs and discover opportunities for design in the COVID-19 world. I'll jump in and talk about framing and how might we frame the priorities for design that come up in discovery. Sarah will talk about evaluating and how might we test concepts, assumptions, hypotheses, and usability. And then Conall will round us out with a discussion in the validate category about how might we validate that a product is safe and effective for use. So I'm going to pass it over to Jemma now to dive into discovery research.
Great, thanks, Jess. Great to see you all virtually here today. as just mentioned, my name is Jemma, and I am a senior user researcher at Bresslergroup. My primary focus is on upfront generative research, so I really love playing in this discovery space that we're about to talk through now. My background is in user experience research as well as product design, so discovering user needs and design opportunities is where I find the most validation and love for research in terms of where I fit into the research process. So a bit about discovery research. When we're thinking about discover, we're playing in the big blue ocean of possibility. So we haven't yet defined our design problem. We are not even close to a design solution. What we're trying to do in the discovery phase of a design project is really understand what the right problem is so that we can design the right solution. So when we think about that goal, the method that we usually use to accomplish that goal typically relies on in-context data that we collect via contextual inquiry from users' environments of use. So going out into people's homes, going out into people's workplaces, and understanding their entire environmental reality in order for us to find insightful opportunities for design. So as fun as that research is, it's a little bit difficult in our COVID reality. So some concerns that we've encountered in these types of projects since we've started living our new normal is a lack of insight into a participant's context of use. So not really being able to see the post-it notes around a laptop that indicate a stopgap that people are using in order to get around a problem in a system. We're missing those workarounds that we can find just through observation within a user's context. Difficult to read facial expressions and missing nonverbal cues. So I think most people agree that a video chat is not the same as being in person and sitting across the table from someone talking. And you miss a little bit of that human element, being able to probe on, I noticed you raised your eyebrow at that moment when we were talking about a certain point in your process. Talk to me about that. So just in general, missing some of those nonverbal cues. And then it's difficult to conduct collaborative co-design sessions with users in order to understand their problems, their pain points, and where there's opportunity for design. So all of those issues aside, when we're thinking about solving for those issues, we really want to think about the questions that are driving discovery. So the research questions that are grounding our work. When you identify what the question is, then you can start thinking about how you solve it. So questions that are typically driving discovery: what are the user needs in this opportunity space? Where can we innovate? So thinking about a space, and then within that, talking to individuals in order to determine where there's an unmet need or a need that is inadequately met. What type of a solution might meet users' needs? A service, a product, an app? So then diving in a little bit deeper, thinking about the criteria of that solution, what that might be, and how we might possibly design to solve for that unmet need. And then if we're developing a next generation of an existing device, what has changed in the user's context of use since the previous release? So oftentimes, if we're designing something that hasn't been updated in 20 years, there's a lot that's changed in the world since then, including users' mental models of how they navigate digital interfaces, ancillary tools that they might be using within that environment that didn't exist 20 years ago. So even if you're building on an existing design, that contextual environmental data is still super helpful with defining what the user needs are for that next phase product. So some strategies to answer those questions that can exist within our current reality. The first strategy we're going to talk about is remote contextual inquiry. So that seems like a bit of a contradiction. We are remote and learning about the context at the same time. But you're able to do interviews and home tours via webcam or some type of FaceTime-like software. This strategy would allow the research team to ask targeted questions, observe in real time the interaction with the product, and ask some follow-up questions immediately. Some of the benefits here that we would lose in a standard remote one-on-one interview is really being able to see that environment and the space that the product is being used within. The second strategy would be going back to old tried and true diary studies. This isn't a method that is used a whole bunch, but for our current reality, it's one that deserves another look. So in a diary study, participants record their experiences in real time via video or written journal. Then this strategy allows the researcher to understand the real-time reaction to a product, service, or activity as the participant is using it. And it's especially useful in the event that a researcher might not be able to be with a user every time that they pick up their toothbrush or every time that they have to read a book to their child. So thinking about what are the moments in time that we want to gather insight around that we might not be able to be physically present for. And diary studies are a really great way to do that, and a possibility within our new normal that isn't really impacted by the fact that we're all remote. This strategy also allows the participant to reflect on their experiences. So when we do meet up to have a retrospective interview with the participant about their interaction with the product, their thoughts and feelings around it, it can be a really concise, clear interview because the participant has already had some time to synthesize their thoughts and think about the way that they feel about a product or service that we're looking at with them. And then the third strategy is using remote interviews, but in conjunction with a digital whiteboard. And on a couple studies, we've had some pretty great success doing this. So traditional one-on-one interviews, typically like this, we're sharing a screen, we're talking about things as if we're sitting next to each other, but we're really not because we have this screen between us. But we could be using the screen to basically develop a visual representation of what we're talking about. So this is especially useful if you're talking to a participant and you want to understand a complex process that they typically go through in their day, some type of system that they're using that isn't really easy for us to completely understand yet, or even map out their emotions that they feel as they're using a product or service or going through a specific life event. So the real benefit of this is not just being able to verbalize and hear participant thoughts, but also map visually what those thoughts are and align with the participant on what they're saying, how that impacts process and systems, and where there's pain points and opportunity for improvement. So not just using the auditory part of our brains, but also relying on the visual part in order to really bring home some interesting, actionable data from an interview. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Jess to take us through the frame portion of today.
Excellent, thanks Gemma, and hello again everyone. My name is Jes Koepfler. My background and PhD is in human-computer interaction, and my focus and background has been on digital products and integrated product experiences. So as a result, I'm always trying to zero in on what we should do, what we call framing, from all of the things that we could do. So all of those methods Gemma just shared with you are fantastic at really opening up the box. And then at some point you have to figure out the narrowed in focus of what you're going to do. And that's what framing is really good for. So this is when we use different research techniques to narrow down from possibilities to more focused solutions. We typically rely on prioritization activities and methods conducted with both end users and business stakeholders. So we're trying to understand sort of that triangle of business, user, and technology in the framing stage. So the good news for framing research is that a lot of our existing methods to frame design already work. A lot of these sort of go-to methods were structured survey-based approaches like Kano models, conjoint analyses, or jobs to be done frameworks. These all still work great with end users. But we still got some challenges to address when it comes to helping the business get aligned on what we're hearing from those end users in terms of prioritization. Where we're seeing those challenges is in bringing together large groups for full-day workshops. So many of you are probably familiar with the technique of gathering a bunch of data, then bringing a whole bunch of people together to talk about it, think through it, sticky note about it, and diagram all those different things together to get to a few final directions. It's a little bit harder now than it used to be. We're also seeing that a lot of people aren't used to working in these distributed teams. You know, not everybody was remote before. Some people are certainly more comfortable with it than others. And particularly across organizations, we're seeing that teams are struggling to get all on the same page together. And that's something that, at least at Bresslergroup, has always been a part of our role, is to help our client teams all get on the same page, which was easier when they were all, you know, down the hallway from each other or a building away. Now we're talking about team members who don't even see each other that often anymore, may not even get on camera. And then just in general, there's uncertainty about how to move forward. So how do we decide what we're gonna do next? And should we just pause and wait until this all goes away? Our answer would be no, because we've got other methods that we can look to. So some of the questions that are driving this are, of all those needs we discovered, which ones are unmet? Of all the ideas we've come up with, which ones should we move forward with? Of all the features we could include, which ones are the must-haves, which ones are the nice-to-haves? What's our MVP? And then how does this all align with our business strategy? So some of our strategies that we've employed for answering these questions in the age of COVID-19 start with kind of breaking things down and taking anything that might have been kind of large scale and immersive and really breaking it into its component parts. So the first strategy is small group multi-step working sessions. So if you think about what your old agenda might have been for your full day workshop and break that up into, say, 2-hour time increments, spread those increments out across a week, you can still engage in really focused, meaningful, powerful conversations with end users and with business stakeholders in group settings, using some of those techniques Jemma mentioned earlier, like remote interviewing and digital whiteboarding. Works as well for end users as it does for business stakeholders. Gives everybody a chance to see the conversation unfolding and contribute in different ways, whether you're a verbal contributor, you're the type of person who prefers to write down your thoughts, or you just need time to digest before you can add to something like asynchronously later. We really recommend taking advantage of the power of asynchronous communication as well as synchronous communication to make sure you're able to get everybody's voice heard. Our second strategy is really encouraging the use of multiple methods. So really dig in and think about your whole toolbox. You know, this might require being willing to do multiple smaller qualitative studies more quickly and iteratively. So maybe you do a love letter, breakup letter activity with users and then glean some insights from that, have it inform what you're doing, and then do another activity later with, say, one user group. 6 interviews later, you've got new insights. You apply those. Now you're ready to go out to yet another user group. So whereas we might have tried to say, let's do 37 interviews all at once as fast as we can, we might now recommend breaking those pieces up and working in perhaps a more agile way than folks are used to. This allows a team to continue moving along at a steady pace without sort of the burnout and exhaustion that can happen by doing all of this type of stuff remotely. We also recommend thinking about, mixing your methods across qualitative and quantitative and really thinking about how can I get the most insights from the smallest number of people qualitatively and then scale that up and understand where I need to focus based on a larger number of users. And then our third strategy is really where you can get the most bang for your buck, which is using the same tool twice. So tools like Kano models and jobs to be done surveys are really powerful with end users. They can be just as powerful with business team members. So gathering data across both can be a very easy way to start to think about what you're hearing on both sides of the coin and bring that information to the business team to see where there might be misalignment, whether that's between users in the business or across different members in the organization. So perhaps the UX team has a very different perspective than the software team, which has a very different perspective than the hardware team. This is a really easy way to sort of take on the burden of analyzing, finding those gaps, and then using that as a way to really focus the conversation and really iron out where there might be misalignment so that the team can move forward. So those are some strategies that have worked really well for us in the framing phase. And now I'm going to pass it off to Sarah to talk about some techniques for evaluation.
Thanks, Jess, and hi everyone. So I'm Sarah and I specialize in quantitative research here at Bresslergroup. I'm a cognitive scientist by training, which means that I've devoted a lot of my time to trying to understand how humans perceive, understand, and interact with the world around them. And so much of the work I do here is evaluating how users understand and interact with new products. And this evaluate phase is really all about bringing ideas to life. So once you've come out of the framing stage with your idea or your prototype, evaluative research refines that concept to make sure that your final product is safe, easy to use, and meets all of your user needs. And you can spend a lot of time in this phase working towards that refinement using a variety of different methods. But for the kind of physical products that we work with frequently here at Bresslergroup, at some point this is probably going to include in-person traditional usability testing. So the challenge for that is very clear. How do I make sure that people can effectively use my product if I can't be in a room with them observing those interactions? There are some remote solutions even for physical product testing, and each comes with their own challenges, but the primary difficulty common to all of these is lack of control. So in the lab, we have very precise control over the materials that we're testing and the access people have to them, the data that we're collecting, including audio and video recordings, and the study environment. But when we're doing research remotely, we give up a lot of that control and need to be more prepared for unexpected situations. So the questions that drive evaluative research can vary quite a bit depending on what your product looks like and what stage you're at, but they can include things like, which prototype that I've developed should we move forward with? Is my product easy to use? How do users perceive and understand different features of the design? And how does the usability compare to my competitor products and the previous generation of my device? And there are many creative ways to answer these questions that don't involve in-person usability testing. So I'm going to talk about a few of the strategies that we use now. So one way that we're trying to keep pushing forward with physical product testing is pivoting our traditional usability testing to remote testing using study kits. So in these kits, we send all of the necessary AV equipment like cameras and tripods, securely packaged study product, a return shipping label, and lots of detailed instructions for participants. And we're then able to basically run sessions similarly to how we would in the lab. So we ask the participant to be more involved in this case and set up their own environment. And then we have them simulate using that product while we observe. And although there are definitely challenges that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, this method approximates in-person testing pretty well for most products. Something else that we found helpful during these COVID times is really focusing the scope of your research. So there can be a tendency when we're doing in-person sessions to make the sessions as long as possible to get the most data that we can out of each participant, especially if you have a rare population that you're looking at. But people do tend to get fatigued more easily in remote research. And so one way to combat that is shifting towards more focused studies that answer just one or two high priority research questions at a time. So for example, you might test setup and use of your product separately if it's a very complex device, or you might get even more specific and ask a question like, is the square prototype or the rectangular prototype easier to hold? Remote quantitative research in the form of surveys or other controlled experiments works particularly well to answer these types of targeted research questions. So in a large-scale quant survey, you can get feedback from a much larger proportion of your intended users than you would get in most qualitative research. And you can use statistical techniques to ensure that the feedback you're getting accurately represents your entire user population. But unmoderated quantitative solutions go well beyond surveys. And even in online studies, we can measure user behavior with accuracy, response times, and eye movements. And this can help us essentially read people's minds and find out what users notice about a product and how they understand and remember certain aspects of the product, even if they can't verbalize that information to us. And so one of the most obvious advantages with these unmoderated quantitative techniques is they tend to be quicker, since you don't need a researcher walking through each session with participants. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Conall to talk about remote validation.
All right, so I'm back. So validation, this is where you ensure your product is safe and effective and meets your design goals. So I'm a design engineer, medical device developer by background, and at Bresslergroup, I focus on ensuring that we bring our user insights to all the phases of product development. So when we talk about validation, with digital products, it hasn't changed that much, to be honest. The methods that we used to use are still valid for current, circumstances. So what I'm going to do is focus here on what's different given COVID and given validation for physical products in face-to-face. As Sarah mentioned, when you're validating physical products, or even when you're evaluating physical products, you often need to have someone put hands on the product. We are still physical beings in a physical world. So a lot of the methods that she just touched on are actually still applicable in the validate portion of this. So I'm just going to focus on what's different. And a lot of that comes into the medical device space and how we handle that. So some of the concerns we've encountered specifically to device validation or product validation are that it's often seen as a required part. It's hard to envision simulating a complete experience and a complete simulated use without having someone physically put hands on the product. And it's really hard to dispute that. Another is that ultimately a lot of our work in the validation space does have to go through a regulatory body. And that means that they kind of set the rules for what's acceptable or what's unacceptable. And there have been standards that have been developed and debated for years now. And suddenly COVID kind of undermines the ability to execute to those standards, or at least to execute to those standards in the way we used to do it. And although regulatory bodies indicate some awareness and willingness to potentially adapt, they need to see proof. They need to be as confident as they were before that the product is safe and effective. And lastly, as Jess alluded to early on, a lot of the products in the medical space are specifically designed for at-risk populations. They're out there to help people who are sick. That's why they exist. So when we think about testing in a time when there's an increased risk of transmissible disease, that becomes a bigger risk and a bigger weight that we need to consider as we think about what's the risk versus reward trade-off here, or risk versus benefit trade-off for bringing these populations in to test. I'm sure the questions that drive validation will surprise nobody, that we need to make sure that the product that we're developing meets the needs that we set out to meet with our design. If it's a medical device, we need to make sure it's safe and effective to use. We also should be challenging ourselves to make sure we're not introducing any new issues for our users. And then of course, to be complete in our risk assessment, we need to do validation. So it may surprise some of you that we recommend still a research by mail method for validating some medical devices and some physical products. It definitely works best for small, simple products that have few user steps and they're designed for in-home use. One of the benefits that in-home use has in terms of research for mail is that that is the most accurate simulated environment for use that you can imagine. The product is designed for the environment you're actually testing it in. So it becomes more realistic even than what we're able to offer with the best staged props at a facility where we bring participants to us. We strongly encourage people to use, or at least think about this method for products where the use is not likely to take them in a direction that would not work well with a webcam. So a lot of physical manipulation of small parts can happen sort of at desk or waist level on a tabletop, and that can be natural. But if you're dealing with a large product that really in real life requires motion around, maybe a webcam or a research-based kit is not the right answer. Regardless, despite the fact that we do encourage this and we have seen success with this, we still encourage everyone who thinks about this method to consider regulatory review before planning on this as their sole method for validation. We think it can be successful. We think it's a great method, but we want to make sure that it's a considered approach. One of the concerns that was also talked about earlier that I wanted to mention here was also about IP when we're shipping product out to participants who are not sort of in our control. And there are some methods that we've put in place to help control that. Clever scheduling and use of couriers that drop off the product right before use, have the person open it on camera, pack it on camera, and have the couriers check the contents right after really gives almost as much control as we might have in the lab. The second method that we're employing, and frankly, we're seeing a lot of the industry go towards, is sort of a behind the glass or some other variation, behind the barrier moderation. In this instance, what happens is the moderator and the participant are in the same room, but they're on opposite sides of a physical barrier. And the real goal is to produce almost exactly the same type of interaction as we had with validation prior to COVID, but now there's just a physical barrier that keeps both parties safe. That can be elevated with the use of PPE in addition to the physical barrier. It certainly requires new operational policies and sometimes structural updates to the space. And actually, one of the trickiest parts is how do you update your protocol and your moderator guide to still allow the interactions to happen in the way that they need to? Or how can you cleverly create similar scenarios, test the same tasks without ever, for example, pausing and making an adjustment on the pump or the device yourself that you're asking your participant to interact with. And we have seen, and we recommend this as a major method for when you have a physical product that really does need to be validated, isn't very good candidate for shipping and for use at home, and you really need to try and get as close to our previous methods as we had before. And then our third and final strategy that we're going to recommend today is similar to the last one, but off-site moderation. So there are cases where you're trying to recruit populations that just aren't all in the right place for your data collection. Maybe you can't recruit enough people in 1 or 2 or even 5 cities, in which case travel becomes a major constraint. It's not easy to get researchers to travel. It's not easy to get participants or clients to travel. So in those studies, we recommend that you use a local partner to set up a room with your guidance and use pan-tilt zoom cameras that can be remotely controlled and an interface, much like we're talking today. So a trained moderator who's really familiar with the product and the protocol can still moderate all the sessions, but is actually thousands or at least hundreds of miles away from the sessions being conducted. One variation on this that Bresslergroup has also built in is to actually build that remote moderation suite in a hospital environment. It has the benefit of avoiding the risk of being shut down due to COVID, and actually gives us slightly better access to those populations that are potentially quite busy and otherwise engaged dealing with the COVID crisis, but they can just stop into our suite before or after shifts, or it doesn't take them out of their daily routine or add additional risk. All right, so with that, I am going to pass it back to Sarah and Jemma to share a few closing thoughts, and then we'll get into our discussion, which I'm really looking forward to.
Thanks, Conall. So I'd like to talk about one of the themes that you might have noticed in our presentation today, and that is our emphasis on mixing methods. So if you bring together all of the different strategies that we talked about today, in this new normal, you might end up with a research program that incorporates many different methods, from remote contextual inquiry to small group working sessions and quantitative studies, each answering a different targeted research question. And for some of you, that may look very different than your typical preferred approach. But because we know that each method has its strengths and weaknesses, combining them often results in the most complete and robust insights. So it may end up being a benefit in the end.
The other thing that we want to leave you guys with is the idea that we're still learning. We're relatively early into this whole new phase of our COVID-19 reality. So we're really interested here in fostering a conversation where we can learn from each other and think about all of the unique challenges that we're encountering within our work, think about the unique challenges that you're encountering in your work, and then think about all of the different ways that we've mitigated those challenges and share and learn from each other. So this is definitely still, we don't know it all. There's still a lot to learn. And as we move forward into this reality that is going to be more remote, even after the quarantine ends, we're going to be growing along with that. And then finally, we would challenge you all to reframe your thinking potentially about this entire topic as a positive. So thinking about each research challenge that we encounter that's new or different because of our new reality as an exciting way for us to tackle thinking about things in a new way. So you might have gotten into your usual methods that you've used time and time again, your old faithfuls that you go back to every time you get a similar research question. And this environment that we're living in now really opens us up to be able to think about things from a different perspective and tackle the research questions that we encounter in our work in new, exciting ways. So this is a great opportunity for us to really expand our toolbox and our brains as well in terms of how we think about research and how we think about solving the problems that our clients have. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jess to lead us through our Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you, Jemma, and thanks to all of my colleagues for this awesome panel. And thank you all for listening in. So there's two opportunities here now. The first is to write questions into the Q&A box, and I will select the questions and direct them at the panelists for response. We'd also like to hear from you. We've got our fair share of experience, but we know everybody else does too. And if you have a perspective to share or a unique challenge that you have encountered, we would love to hear from you. And we have the ability, I believe, within this platform for you to raise your hand, and then I can unmute you and give you a chance to talk if you are interested in doing so. So first we'll go to the questions as I see they are rolling in. The first question, Conall, I will direct your way and then invite any of the other panelists to jump in. And that question is that there seems to be a perception that remote research is cheaper, which seems like a pretty healthy advantage. Have you found this to be true in the recent switch to some of these remote methods that your team has taken on?
Thanks for that question, and certainly very on point. Absolutely something we talk about with just about every person that we interact with as a client of Bresslergroup. And of course, the answer is, as always, it depends a little bit. I can say that across the board, there's sort of two elements to what's going to change when you pivot your research from planned in person to planned for remote. There are a lot more logistics that go into remote research, and there are also logistics that aren't as routine as maybe they used to be, both because research by mail is not something that was the default for so many of our products that we're testing, and also because there are new considerations that we have around COVID and making sure that both our participants and the people who are sending and receiving our packages stay safe. Ultimately, what we're seeing is that the budgets that were planned for in-person research are more or less shaking out to be about the same for the same type of research now done remotely. What you're making a trade-off is between renting physical space and bringing people in to investment in appropriate equipment, packaging, and logistics to get the equipment out to people and back. Within all those additional controls, there's always the cheap, slow way to ship things and the expensive, controlled way to do it. And with research, especially when you're sending out physical prototypes that you really want to get back, you're going to invest in the more controlled and signature-based tracked items. The other element I mentioned was scheduling. So, the other piece of what changes when you switch from in-person to remote is how long it takes. And certainly we do see schedules stretching out, partially because we just need to pivot all of the planning from an in-person plan to a remote, if that's for any studies that were planned before COVID and now need to be switched over. But even for new studies, there just is a lot more time that needs to be built in to send out product and get it back. And we need to ensure that we don't start a session with a participant not having their package yet, and we don't plan for sessions to happen too soon if we're going to be recycling any of the equipment like the webcams or the stimuli, and they need to be cleaned. So we're seeing that it's possible, and certainly, as Jess alluded to earlier, there's long checklists that we've generated to help ensure nothing gets forgotten. But all in, we're seeing timelines increase at least a little bit as you pivot from in-person to remote, and budgets remaining about the same from in-person and remote data collection.
Excellent. Thank you, Conall. Related follow-up question, I'll let Sarah start with this. So speaking of those study kits and that research by mail approach, we discussed earlier this idea of participation rates, and there's a question about whether or not we're seeing any participation rate issues with the task of respondents having to send things back to us. Has it changed people's willingness to participate in our studies, and or have we had any issues getting our products back?
Yeah, so I have good news on that front. Very recently, we did one of these study by mail type approaches with a fairly large sample of participants for a formative study. So I think we had about 35 people. We didn't have an issue getting these participants, though it wasn't a very rare population. And we have received all of the kits back. We received them back pretty quickly. And I think the trick there is that we're not releasing our incentives until we get the product shipped back. So I think that is a great motivator for people to send things back. That being said, in general, we're trying to increase our over-recruit for all of these methods. So we did have, I think, about a 40% over-recruit instead of the 20% that we would typically use. We definitely had some no-shows there. So I think we would recommend kind of taking that conservative approach.
Excellent, thank you. And a question for Jemma here. You mentioned digital whiteboarding and interviews sounded really interesting to one of our participants, and they just like you to share any tips or tricks or things to keep in mind with digital whiteboarding, and if there are tools you like and things of that nature.
Sure. So when it comes to digital whiteboarding tools, I've used Mural and I've used Miro, so two very similar sounding digital whiteboard tools. Both of them accomplish the goal pretty well of being able to have a space that you can modify and change quickly and develop that shared understanding with the participant. Some things that I would keep in mind is if you're moderating an interview session, it's quite difficult to take notes, update a Miro board, and also maintain the track of conversation. So we found that in addition to having a moderator and a Miro board developer, we would also have a dedicated note taker. So that does add a little bit in terms of how you collect the data and the people involved, but it's worth it in the end for the richness and visual nature of the data that you get from building out a Miro board in real time with your participant. So I would definitely recommend thinking through the note-taking process if you're going to be doing an interview with a shared digital whiteboard. Additionally, keeping the whiteboard as simple as possible. It's sticky notes, it's a process map, it's something that's easy for the participant to understand and wrap their head around is also really helpful.
Excellent, thank you. Follow-up question for Conall. So when it comes to validating products for home use, that might require or might result in a participant potentially injuring themselves. Have you handled that? Have you dealt with that? Or are there just methods you would avoid when it comes to those types of products? Thinking this example, the question's about a personal injectable.
Yeah, it's a great question. Certainly should be the topic of much discussion for anyone who's planning to validate, just like it was when we were doing in-person sessions. Obviously, there's a little bit more comfort if you can just reach across the table and stop someone from accidentally injuring themselves. But even as we think about the in-person constraints that come due to COVID with the PPE and the barriers, that reality of being able to stop someone mid-accident is pretty remote. You might be able to react a little bit faster, but you're still not going to be able to prevent it. So what you need to do, and what we've been doing on our projects, is really have a good strategy, document it as part of your protocol, include your clinical affairs, have a strategy around adverse event reporting, and from the get-go, see what you can do to eliminate the risk from the stimuli that you're using without impacting the end user experience. What needs to be there in a validation of a product is that it's production equivalent. But there are ways to, for example, use needleless product if what we're studying in this validation is not the action of injecting. To use blunted needles to remove drug product and use some sort of a simulant. There are opportunities always to make the device a little bit safer. And it's also a bit of a risk evaluation relevant to the specific population you're looking at. Healthcare providers who are day in and day out using similar products to do similar activities may be a much lower risk than a patient population that doesn't use this medical device, but they're included because they might be eligible. And that might come down to helping you decide, is this an appropriate product for a remote research method? Or should we really bring people in where we can feel comfortable that we've trained them and can present them with the product in a safe way.
Excellent. And Sarah, a question for you. Can you speak to some other remote quantitative methods that might exist out there besides surveys? Some people are worrying about survey fatigue amongst participants and just in the world in general, and wanting to hear about some other opportunities.
Yeah, so I think anytime you have a research question that deals with something like, can people hear or see this or understand it? This is a great candidate for a remote quantitative study that's not a survey. And we can come up with some pretty interesting and creative solutions that keep participants engaged. And I'll mention just one very recent example. We were trying to understand whether people could hear some auditory feedback from a device when they're doing other things in their daily life. So we were able to do a controlled quantitative study run online where we engaged participants in a very mentally taxing task, played these sounds, and we were able to statistically understand whether they were able to perceive them or not.
Excellent. And I'll pile on and share that in lieu of surveys during the framing phase, there are other activities that you can do that can be pretty fun, particularly prioritization exercises that are almost game-like. So there's one prioritization activity that we like to use in-house, in-person, called Moscow Poker. You can Google it online and see how it works, but it's about sort of giving everybody a chance to hear what the priority or the idea or the user need is, and then gives everybody a chance in the group to, at the same time, share whether they think it's a must-have, could have, should have, or would have. You can pretty easily replicate that activity in an online digital forum as a way of engaging people in sort of that same in-person process, but in a way that yields slightly more kind of closed-ended, not quite quantitative, but certainly closed-ended approaches to gathering that feedback, and gives everybody a chance to have a thought. And then obviously more vocal people are still going to be more vocal online as they are in person, but it gives everybody a chance to participate. And as a facilitator, it gives you the chance to really ask somebody to speak up if they had a particularly divergent opinion that is worth getting more feedback on. So everybody else said something was a could have, and this one person felt it was a must have. It's a chance to really probe and understand that better. So really a lot of leveraging of the digital whiteboard, which is something that's just been a ton of fun to experiment with anyway for ourselves from a geeking out perspective, but then really effective both with end users and with businesses. Those are all the questions that have come in so far. I'd also like to take just a moment to pause and see if anybody who is on the line would like to share a particular strategy they have used, or share a challenge that has come up for them that has not yet been addressed that we could all be thinking about together. And while I give folks a chance to raise their hand or to add another question, I'll just make a note that if you do want to learn anything else about what we've talked about today, about other product development and innovation ideas, please do check out our blog. Please do sign up for a newsletter. And please also feel free to reach out to us directly. We're excited and available to chat about anything else that you're experiencing during the COVID-19 crisis and beyond, and interested in learning with you and sharing our thoughts. Looks like we have no further questions and nobody bravely willing to raise their hand and come off mute. So we will wrap up here. Thank you again to the panelists, Conall, Sarah, Jemma, and for all of you for joining in. You'll get a recording via a link of this recording sent to you in about 24 to 48 hours. So thanks again.